I had pinned one of those cheap paper hearts to the mantel, the kind you could buy in packs of 50 at the craft store, and every time I walked past the living room, I felt the ridiculous optimism of it tug at something in my chest. The house smelled like lemon oil and sawdust, not entirely fresh, but honest. I had stripped the floors to their bones, sanded until the wood looked like riverbed, and refinished them a color I told myself was warm chestnut, though in the raw light of the afternoon it read as determination. Light pooled through the tall sash windows in the front room and hit the whitewashed bricks of the fireplace, the way a spotlight would at the climax of a movie. For a while, I let myself believe that someone else should already be here to watch it happen. My name was Claire Bennett. I taught ninth grade English at Jefferson High, which meant I lived in syllables and sentence diagrams and the quiet, stubborn faith that adolescents will suddenly get better at commas. I had chosen this little 1920s craftsman bungalow in the inner east side of Portland because its bones made promises and built-in bookshelves, a kitchen with a window above the sink, a backyard that wanted a garden. I had spent the last 9 months carving it into a home with my own hands. I know how that sounds, and trust me, I recoiled at the cliché even as my hands stayed sticky with paint and plaster dust. I had everything lined up for the night. Mismatched vintage plates, the good string of fairy lights that gave the porch a soft horizon, bowls of olives, a roast that had spent the afternoon mingling with rosemary and garlic, a playlist that moved from Billie Holiday into something more modern and then back again because I liked the way the songs kept catching people off guard. I had strung paper lanterns in the backyard, between 2 weathered maple trees, and spent an entire afternoon coaxing the neighbor's cat, a patient ginger called Cooper, into tolerating my presence so he'd be a comforting, lazy presence on the lawn. The plan was simple in its audacity, my housewarming. It was, in my small calendar-dominated life, the big event. Not the inauguration of a presidency or anything monumentally global, but for me, a teacher who graded essays and collected pastel, post-its of progress, and put off buying new shoes because of unexpected vet bills with Cooper. It was big. I had invited family. I had reminded them twice. I had curated a seating chart in my head. Imagined my mother standing in the doorway, my father laughing too loud at some joke of his own making, Marcus, my brother, holding court with a cheap whiskey and stories that made everyone tilt their heads and smile. I wanted, more than anything, for my family to witness the house the way I saw it, a thing I had made from necessity and stubbornness and a weekly budget. I wanted their presence to feel like validation, the kind that hums quietly into your ear and tells you belong here. Nobody came. At first, I told myself they were late. Portland traffic can be theatrical. Marcus had a knack for being delayed and arriving, as if the delay were a part of his charm. I set another bottle of wine on the counter. I wiped my hands on a towel and rearranged the succulents on the windowsill. Because plants, at least, are steady. I checked the time and then my phone, the way people check when they are hoping they missed a message that will change the trajectory of the evening. I refreshed the family chat like it was a radio dial and not a group of adults, some of whom had the power to make everything in me feel small. The family chat, of course, was a theater in miniature. It was called Bennett Huddle, a name my mother had insisted on when she first created the group 3 years ago, and we had used it for everything from holiday RSVPs to passing along recipes. That evening, when I finally looked at it, there was a flood of pictures, a string of unhappy-looking balloons, a bedazzled cake with the words, "Marcus's Big Day," piped in thick blue icing, people wearing press-on smiles that read fake from across any room. There was a video clip of Marcus, slick with sweat and whiskey, holding a phone camera and standing on what, at first glance, I thought was a rooftop. He was grinning at the camera like a man who had just closed a deal. "Got the keys!" his caption read. "Bought the loft in the Pearl. Celebration tonight." The Pearl. My chest constricted so violently that, for a second, I couldn't figure out how to breathe. The Pearl District looms in Portland like a badge of sorts. Old warehouses turned into modern glass. Coffee that costs the kind of money that hurts. An air of success you can almost touch. Marcus had never owned property a day in his life. He rented a studio 2 neighborhoods over and drove a car. He didn't pay for outright. He was the kind of man who could spend 3 paychecks on a guitar and then be shocked at the end of the month when his bank account offered him a look akin to pity. Marcus, who, when we were children, used to turn his baseball glove inside out and insist the heart was on the outside, had Apparently bought a loft. I scrolled the comments. So proud of you, Em. From our aunt. Congratulations, baby. From my mother, as if she were handing out certificates of achievement. We'll come by tomorrow to see it. Someone wrote, and they meant it as grace. But it stung like neglect. My own name had been mentioned once, in a single-line note from my mother. Sorry, Claire. The timing didn't work. Big celebration for Marcus. There was no apology beyond the logistics. I felt small and ridiculous and suddenly incandescent with something like fury. The party I had planned, the one I had built from scratch in hope, the food shimmering in the oven, it was both real and invisible to them. They had not only chosen to be elsewhere, they had chosen to celebrate something else that involved Marcus being center stage. I put the phone face down on the table and tried to tell myself it didn't matter. Then, like a mouth that refused to stay silent, I called Marcus. He answered on the second ring, the sound of his laugh as casual as a gust. Claire, hey, you should come up to the Pearl, you have to see it, it's unreal. What is going on? My voice felt like sandpaper. Did you buy a loft? Yeah, bought it, closed this morning, drinks at my place tonight, you should come, we've got everyone here. He said everyone like it was not a heavy armor. We're celebrating, Mom's here. Pa too. You should see. You knew about my housewarming. The words fell out like stones I had been carrying in a coat pocket for months. You all knew. You could have come. A silence stretched across the line. Claire, He sounded coiled. We celebrated the loft, yeah, but You thought you'd celebrate your life instead of mine? The question was too sharp. It sounded like a verdict. I could see, vividly, the fireplace of my living room in the light of unshared intention. There are different kinds of quiet. This was the kind that hummed with something I had always been allergic to. Exclusion masked as accident. He mumbled something about timing and money and how it had to happen tonight. He didn't apologize. He didn't once say he was sorry. He simply offered logistics as excuse, and it was the smallest kindness possible. A band-aid on something that needed a surgical truth. I closed my phone and let the heat of it sink into the palm of my hand. The fairy lights blinked like tiny, impartial witnesses. The roast in the oven gave a protesting, fragrant plea, and the house, in its newness, seemed suddenly too clean for the rawness inside me. At 7, 3 people showed up. Maya, my oldest friend from college with an ability to arrive like a comet and always bring some truth in her wake. Lucas, who worked at the bookstore and who had the habit of folding his hands when he listened like he might suspend the world between his fingers, and a neighbor I had met while hauling a dresser up the back steps, a retired school librarian named Mrs. Alvarez who had brought a pie the color of late afternoon. They stepped across the threshold like they were walking into the middle of a quiet film and refused to be extras. Maya put her hand on my shoulder as if she could physically anchor me, and when she laughed it was a real sound that reached my eyes. You should have seen it, she said, as if describing a painting. She then proceeded to offer an astonishing, mundane assessment of the lighting, the way the curtains folded, the placement of the lamp by the window. It's like being in a book that's trying on a new life, she said, and I wanted to hold that sentence like a secret. Lucas sat on the floor with his back to the sofa and helped me open bottles. He complimented the polish on the floor with a sort of stunned reverence I had only ever seen when people discover a favorite book. You did this, he said simply. Look at this. There was warmth in the statement, not the hollow warmth of obligated flattery, but the steady kind that means someone has paid attention. Mrs. Alvarez, Carmen, she told us to call her, popped the pie into the center of the coffee table and peered at my hands. You cut the baseboard yourself? She asked, incredulous. I did, I confessed, a small and private pride rising. The 3 of them sat, drank, and told stories that slouched into the night like content cats. They were, as the old rose-colored phrase went, my people. By 9, my mother did appear. She always arrived like a judgment slipping on a soft shoe, a careful step that meant she had rehearsed compassion, but not quite brought it into focus. Patricia Bennett was an immaculate woman in bags and silk, the kind of woman who could speak softly while sharpening a critique into a talon. She surveyed the house in 5 seconds and decided the kitchen island could have been centered better. You should have removed those curtains for the paint, she said, smiling the way a critic smiles when they want to be tender but cannot risk it. They'll mute the light. They were vintage, I said. I thought it added character. Patricia's laugh was like a coin clinking in a dish. Character is great for flea markets, Claire, but you don't want your buyers or your guests to feel like they walked into someone's attic. I felt something in me, a slow and dangerous pressure. I had rehearsed, in the quiet of my life, responses to this sort of thing, small, strategic articulations that could deflect. But that evening, the pressure did not ease. Perhaps it was the accumulation of months of small cuts. Perhaps it was the half-empty glass of wine. Whatever the reason, the sentences that rose from my chest had an honesty that felt almost savage. "You always made everything about Marcus," I said. I didn't know if it was a question or a verdict. "You always moved the spotlight." Patricia's hand landed on the back of a dining chair as if to steady herself. "That's not fair, Claire. You know family is complicated. Marcus just had an opportunity." "Opportunity," I repeated, feeling how the word made a mockery of the years when he had left dishes in the sink for days and expected the world to clean itself. "Opportunity is this. You show up when it matters to someone else. You don't go to a party and forget a whole house across town." She drew a slow breath as if to arrange her words in an envelope. "You have this tendency to make everything into a battle," she said finally. "You always compete with Marcus. Always have." There it was, the old framing, the neat categories the family had assigned me without even asking. "I'm not competing," I said, and the thing that came after was not a plea but a hammer. "I'm trying. I fixed this place. I have been the one to put in the hours. You all decided you'd rather cheer for his made-up mirage tonight." Patricia's mouth went thin, and then she did something I had never seen her do before. She shook. "You're being dramatic," she said, as if drama were a disease I had caught. That was when I lost the careful restraint I had practiced my entire life. Old, layered irritations had built a kind of wooden dam inside me, and at that moment the dam cracked. "I'm not dramatic," I said. "I am tired of your version of charity where you hand out praise to the person who shouts loudest and ignore the person who sweats to build something real. You have always treated Marcus like he is a prize animal, and me like an inconvenient fact. I am not your inconvenient fact." It was the first time I had called her out like that. The first time I had let the air carry the truth that my childhood had been less a narrative and more a practice in earning love. For a moment, our eyes locked, and I saw in hers a thin, uncertain glare, as if she had been accustomed to the role of theater director and was now flummoxed to be on stage herself. Patricia left without a word of goodnight. She took her coat and the silence landed like a physical thing in the room. She did not slam the door. She simply removed herself as if the house had been a play she had been watching without learning the script. When my father came the next evening, it was like watching the same play with a different actor. Richard Bennett was mild in much of the world, but his mildness had an edge, a passive precision that had always found ways to articulate disappointment as advice. He arrived with a casserole dish and a look that suggested he had mapped disappointments into consumable servings. "It's cozy," he said, and his mouth made a roundness at the end of the word that meant he meant it only insofar as it was a thing to be judged. He sat at my kitchen table and opened his hands as if to count reasons. "You could have chosen a more central color for the walls," he suggested. "The living room is a bit personal." "You mean not neutral enough?" I asked, my voice steady. He tilted his head, a motion like a man tilting a bottle to see how much liquid remained. "I worry it might affect resale value. You are planning ahead, yes?" "I'm not building for resale," I said, and my voice held the kind of quiet that meant there was more to come. "This is my home. I'm not looking for your stamp of approval, Dad." He pursed his lips. "We just want what's best for you," he said as if he were reminding me of a truth he had been appointed to broadcast. "You know, Marcus is doing so well. Perhaps he could help you with a small investment, a loan. We want to see you comfortable." It was a suggestion like a wedge. "I don't want your loan," I said. "And I don't want Marcus's help. I want to be measured by what I choose, not by what I can't afford." He looked at me then with that awful, familiar pity, the one that had been doled out in childhood in equal portions with hand-me-down sweaters and birthday cards. "I worry you're isolating yourself," he said. "You're young, Claire. You should be thinking about the future." "I am thinking about the future," I said. "It's just not the future you planned for me." He left a day later with the casserole dish still full. He didn't raise his voice. He simply moved through the house like a man who had decided to withdraw favor without the messy necessity of a fight. For the next week, I walked around my house like someone learning the rooms all over again. The pictures on the walls looked at me like witnesses. I kept waiting for a note in the Bennett huddle. Instead, there were posts. Marcus standing in a loft with high ceilings, the light reflecting off a new espresso machine, a caption full of exclamation and domestic conquest. In the family chat, they called me dramatic and overly sensitive, adjectives that landed with the cool brutality of adult verdicts. One cousin, who had historically been gentle with me, wrote, "Claire always makes things about herself. Can't she be happy for Marcus?" Another sent a gif of a soap opera mouth falling open. It should have surprised me less than it did, that behind the polished veneer of our family's life lay a script that had been written long ago. But human cruelty is often the most ordinary thing. It wears the clothes of etiquette and habit. I found myself sitting in Dr. Evelyn Hart's office on a rainy Tuesday, the tape on my heels making tiny sounds when I shifted. Dr. Hart, silver gray hair and a tidy bun, glasses perched like a question, had the kind of patient eyes that were trained to find the fissures beneath speech. "You're describing a pattern," she said after I had told her, with the same cinematic elongation my life had been experiencing, about the housewarming and the family's absence and the thinness of their apologies. "It sounds like there's a dynamic here of the golden child and the scapegoat." The phrase landed on me like a hand on the shoulder. "Explain." She did so with measured clarity. "The golden child is the one who embodies family ideals, whose successes are feted regardless of merit. They may be reckless and still be praised because the family narrative demands it. The scapegoat is the one who bears the blame, for everything from failed holidays to the day you broke your wrist at 12 because someone left the stairs unlit. It's a role assigned, not chosen, and it is hard to escape because families," she said, "love their stories more than they love truth." I remember thinking, that phrase, golden child and scapegoat, was the precise articulation of the grammar my family had been speaking for as long as I could remember. Marcus had been the golden child, charismatic, forgiven for lateness and sloppiness, coaxed into applause. I had been the scapegoat, meticulous, corrected, my acts of care reframed as faultless zeal. She offered words for everything that had been unnamed. "You've been performing," she said gently. "Not intentionally, but to fit a mold. If you step out of it, two things can happen. Either the family will change, or you will need to build your chosen family." The last part felt less like advice and more like a permission slip. Chosen family. The phrase had a warm, radical power to it. It meant people who would come when they said they would because they had made a promise beyond obligation. So I called Maya. I asked Lucas. I knocked on Mrs. Alvarez's door and asked if she would like to come over every Sunday to teach me about pruning and patience. My friends, perhaps blessedly ignorant of the gravity of years of withheld praise, came with paint rollers and elbow grease and laughter. Maya brought a ladder and a pair of gloves and the kind of energy that could fill a room. Lucas came with a crate of books he had culled from the store, because he believed that a house is a home when it contains stories. We painted the spare room a color I called evidence of dawn. We planted a row of lavender and rosemary along the back fence. We made a small herb garden that smelled like possibility. Mrs. Alvarez taught me how to bend my knees when I shoveled, how to talk to a plant like you would an old friend. "Tell it what you want it to be," she said. "Plants are greedy for clarity. There is a particular kind of light that happens when comradeship builds something practical." The house no longer felt like a hollow theater stage waiting for a cast. It began to breathe with life. A sock that belonged to no one, a mug on the sill, a book left face down on the coffee table. My friends brought their own flavors of stubbornness and made the house seem into a home with their stories, their quiet Saturday morning eggs, the way Lucas left his bookmark in an old copy of The Bell Jar. It was messy and imperfect and, in its own way, the most honest thing I had ever built. The family chat continued to whisper and hiss. They continued to call me dramatic and overly sensitive, as if those were diagnoses with no cure. Marcus posted a string of photos of him in his loft, leaning against beams like a man who owned not just a place, but destiny. He seemed to take ownership of the idea of success as if it were proof that the universe had finally bowed to his charisma. Then, on a rain-streaked Tuesday evening, he appeared on my doorstep. He walked in with a briefcase that looked rented and a smile like a shield. "Claire," he said, as if the single syllable could be a neutral thing. He scanned the room like a man measuring property. "You're late for the party," I said, and I meant it as an observation, not bait. "I came for something else," he said. "I have a business proposition. Look, He opened the briefcase with the casual theatricality of someone used to people giving him room. Inside were documents, some glossy and some clearly printed from a home printer. "I need investment capital," he said. "There's a startup I'm getting in on. Tech, it's big. If you put in some money, you'll see a return. Big, trust me." He didn't apologize for his earlier absence. He didn't acknowledge the family's intentional choice to be elsewhere. He asked instead for money. I closed my eyes for a second and remembered my father's casserole, my mother's silent treatments, the way our family had applauded Marcus for being louder, brighter, unbothered by consequence. I remembered the quiet nights when I had nursed a student through an anxiety attack and then returned home to sink into the quiet, my hands still smelling faintly of antiseptic because teaching ninth grade as a nurse of words had its own small amputations of self. I felt, in that precise moment, my life weighed against a proposition that read like greed disguised as opportunity. "Why would I invest in you?" I asked. The question was simple and necessary. Marcus blinked as if I'd posed a problem he had never considered. "Because I'm family," he said, and said it like a man reading a script. "You abandoned my housewarming," I said. "You chose to celebrate another life instead of mine. You posted a lie about buying a loft so the family would treat you like a success. Why would I put my hard-earned money into something you can't be honest about?" He stood there like a man expecting a stage to be reset. "You don't get to make me into a villain," he said. "I'm offering you an opportunity." "Opportunity," I said again. The word was a kind of mirror. "You want my savings so your gamble can look like success. No, I will not be collateral for your narrative." He tried another tact then, softer, as if coaxing a wild animal back to trust. "Claire, we're family. We look out for each other. This could be a chance to build something together." "We already had a chance," I said. "You had the chance tonight to show up. You had the chance to come to my house and celebrate me. You chose to be elsewhere, celebrating your own illusions. You chose the optics over the truth. I do not invest in lies." He left with the briefcase under his arm and the kind of wounded dignity that he had been taught to wield like a shield. He didn't shout. He didn't beg. He simply folded himself back into the gravity of his chosen identity, one that said he was always owed something. When the door shut, the house seemed quieter and oddly fuller. It was as if a draft had been closed that had been letting the family's old habits chill the place. The air smelled of lemon and lavender and the faint dust of fresh paint. I stood in the center of my living room and felt the weight of my own decisions settle. There were nights after that when I lay awake and let the past unfurl, the small humiliations, the organized neglect, the kindnesses that had been doled out like favors rather than rights. I thought, as Dr. Hart had suggested, about the possibility that families do not always reform. Sometimes their stories are patented, and you can try to edit them, but the patent holds. Sometimes the only way forward is to assemble a new narrative from different people. And so I did. We had a small pizza night a month later. Friends came with blankets, and the neighbor kids broke the hush with loud opinions about superhero movies. We planted a row of sunflowers along the fence, and they shot up like fireworks that lasted for weeks. Mrs. Alvarez taught me how to graft rosemary and taught me that pruning is an act of faith. Lucas would arrive with muscle memory and a box of books and stay for hours talking about the rhythm of words. Maya would bring lamb skewers and a kind of vivid truth that made you laugh until tears leaked. We had a Thanksgiving that was unceremonious and wholly ours. No family heirlooms, no childhood scripts, just a folding table covered in mismatched cloths and a thrumming sense of gratitude for people who had chosen to be present. My father called once after months of silence. He asked about the house. I answered with directness I had never practiced. "We pruned the maples," I told him. "We painted the spare room sky blue. We hosted people who mattered." He listened and then offered, as if planting a pebble in a river, "We miss you." There was something in that. Perhaps regret. Perhaps an ache. But it did not make the past dissolve. It simply was a small gesture of the kind people are capable of when their habits feel the friction of time. Marcus sent a postcard once, a small, glossy thing with his handwriting across the front. Thinking of you. It arrived with a postage stamp and a smell of smoke, and the kind of wanting that looks cheap when it is not tethered to concrete change. I kept the postcard on the mantel for a week and then moved it to the drawer with the old Polaroids. It was not scrawled over with apology. It was a signal, perhaps, that he had found the border of his life and was mapping his way out. Or perhaps it was merely an attempt to keep a loose string tied to me. Either way, it did not pull me. The house, the work, the people who had found their way into it, they became my measuring sticks. I did not need Patricia's approval for the curtains. I did not need Richard's casserole to validate my choices. I had built not just a structure of wood and plaster, but a horizon of people who would come when they promised, and who would not turn the spotlight to themselves simply because it was easier. Sometimes, late at night, I would sit on the porch with a cup of tea while the city settled and the maple trees whispered above like confidants. I would set my hand on the arm of the old wicker chair and feel, physically, the scars my hands had earned. The paint smudges on my nails were like a map of everything I had laid claim to. There is no single perfect moment of liberation. It is more like a series of small, patient choices that accumulate like pebbles in a riverbed and eventually reroute the current. One quiet afternoon in late summer, Mrs. Alvarez and I walked the backyard and pinched the heads of lavender to see the scent bloom. She looked at me sideways and said, "You made something. It is yours, and it will hold people that deserve it." "That seems like an enormous truth," I said. She laughed, that warm librarian sound, and patted my hand. Truth is often enormous, but people keep it small so it fits into their day. You, Claire, you held on to the big part. There was a softness in my chest that I had not expected. The surprise of being seen by someone who had not grown up inside my family knot. It was the kind of warmth that was not about being patted on the head, but about being acknowledged with the full measure of your messy, inconvenient life. Months later, when I stood in the doorway of my home and watched Maya and Lucas carry a battered piano up 3 narrow flights, the house felt like a vessel that had been christened not by tradition but by truth. It held noise and disagreement and laughter that sometimes hurt with its honesty. It held people who were stubborn enough to show up. I learned a final humble thing through all of it. Family is not a given. Family is an architecture that can be constructed in different materials. Blood is not a mortgage on your identity. You can build walls that keep out the cold of expectation, and you can open windows for the sunlight that actually warms you. On a particular evening when the sky had the tender gray of pre-rain, I put my hand against the plaster of the wall in the living room. The room where old paint met new and the seams were slightly imperfect. My fingers felt the tiny grooves and the roughness left by the application, and in that tactile, unremarkable moment I felt full. I had painted over old scars and chosen new colors. I had learned to refuse investment in illusions, and to invest instead in the slow, patient capital of people who would not ask me to cost myself for their applause. Not all families are families, I thought, borrowing the slow, steady axiom I had come upon in small clinical statements in Dr. Hart's office. But families can be made. They can be assembled, like furniture from a catalog, piece by careful piece. They can be painted and pruned and fed and made to hold the small, stubborn lives of people who want to be seen. The house was quiet then. The lights were dimmed. Outside, a neighbor's dog barked at the distant dog of someone's old habit. Inside, I walked from room to room like a woman who had learned to count the reasons she had stayed. I was tired and satisfied and a little surprised that the exhaustion felt like a kind of honor. I lived with my hands in the small things after that: planting, mending, baking. I spoke with my friends in the language of care and sometimes with my family in the language of polite silence. I did not shove an entire life into a ring to be judged by people who had not learned to measure the circumference of my risk. I learned that the word family could be liquid and adaptive. I learned that apologies were possible, and yet not always the right currency. On a raw, honest morning months later, Marcus came by again, not with a briefcase this time, but with a small, sheepish smile and a bag of groceries. He did not bring champagne or proclamations. He had, in the month since his loft had been revealed, tasted edges of things that had not been cooked for him. He stood in the doorway like a man trying on a new coat, and I held out a tea towel like a peace flag and let the small things be what decided us. "Can I help?" he asked, and for once the question was not hollow. We did not make grand statements. We did not publish our reconciliations on social media. We did not require forgiveness like a public ceremony. We washed dishes together, awkward and careful. He told a story about his loft that involved a leaky pipe and a blocked sink, and I laughed, the sound coming out like a small, surprised thing. He made a clumsy joke about his big move, and for a moment we both pretended to be younger, to forget the weight of assigned roles. When he left that day, the house seemed, for the first time, to be a place where the possibility of messy reconciliation lived alongside safety. It was not a happy ending in the cinematic sense. It was a continuation. There was neither triumph nor total defeat. There was the gradual unfolding of ordinary things: neighbors borrowing sugar, friends bringing extra chairs, a family chat that sometimes, on rare mornings when the mood was softer, sent an actual message of support rather than a gif. I suppose that is the truth of it. Life rarely hands us the high drama of tidy closings. It gives us instead a dialectic of small decisions: when to set a boundary, when to open a door, when to plant lavender. My house, with its imperfect wood and stubborn maples, became a repository for these decisions. It held my anger and my reconciliations and my friends and my plants and a coat that never quite dried because someone forgot it on the porch. If you ask me what the lesson was, I might say it was this: not every person with your blood will recognize the work you have done. Some will only see the theater of your life and decide to applaud someone else. That realization will hurt in ways that seem unfair. But you can be brave enough, gradually and not all at once, to build a family that shows up. You can be brave enough to say no to investment from those who profit from your silence. You can be brave enough to accept help from people who do not owe you anything. That night, after everyone left and the house hummed, with a gentleness that felt like a good book ending, I stood at the window and watched the streetlights stitch the neighborhood into a soft geometry. The maple leaves clicked in the wind like a delicate applause. Inside the mantel, the paper heart still clung to the brick, a cheap, imperfect token, and I smiled because, in its own fragile way, it had been right. Something in me had been brave enough to care, and in caring I had, slowly and stubbornly, made myself a home.